Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Dwyer from Trusaic, and I'm here to speak to you about the rising importance of data quality in diversity, equity, and inclusion monitoring. And it's my pleasure to speak to you today. I'm the Vice President of Data Science at Trusaic. A little bit about me. I've been with Trusaic for over 3 years. Before that, I was working in litigation as an economist and as a statistician. And it's a pleasure to move into pay equity from that work. It's been very, very rewarding for me to be involved with this effort. All right, so sorry about that. What's our outline for today? Well, we have 4 essential elements that we want to discuss today, that I'd like to discuss today. First, just briefly review why and how it is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are becoming such a top human resource priority. Second, focusing on pay equity auditing and workforce data as to how to approach that and best think about it. And then we're going to go into the 5 dimensions of data quality. Why data quality is so important, not only just to pay equity. Pay equity is going to be a kind of a focus of this talk because it plays such a role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll get to that a little bit later about its complementarity to other and deeper equity issues. So then we'll talk about some of the essential elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion monitoring. And again, it'll be sort of heavily oriented towards pay equity, but you'll see how it applies to other issues such as applicant hiring, promotion, and retention issues. Okay, so why is it that diversity, equity, and inclusion is becoming such a top human resource priority? Well, we've got some big changes here this year. Jenny Yang has been appointed as the head of the OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, Federal Contract Compliance Programs. She has identified pay equity as a top federal contracting priority. She introduced the component 2, which required employers with at least 100 employees to report pay data to the EEOC. Second, Charlotte Burrows has been appointed the head of the EEOC. Charlotte's has recognized the persistent pay gap for women, and that it's even worse, the pay gap for women of color. So these are top priorities for and becoming high priority items, especially for the EEOC as well as the OFCCP. Third, just in terms of domestic national administrative issues, Vice President Harris has raised the issue of pay equity throughout her political career. As a presidential candidate, Harris proposed requiring companies to report their wage data to the EEOC and proposed that companies be fined if they fail to meet certain pay certification standards. And then just this past month, as part of that administration, the Biden executive order establishes a government-wide initiative to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility in all parts of the federal workforce. So that's at the national level, pretty much just this year with the new incoming administration, that pay equity and diversity and inclusion are getting a big push. Second, if we step back from the national stage and look more at state trends, what I have here is from the Women's Bureau from the Department of Labor. This is a map of pay transparency protections. Pay transparency is the protection, the legal protection for workers to be able to discuss their pay, their compensation with each other without fear of reprisals, that there's no need to maintain confidentiality on that. The Women's Bureau also produces a map just like this that shows which states have their own pay equity legislation. If you look at that, you'll see that every state except Mississippi has their own pay equity legislation on top of federal equal pay, the Federal Equal Pay Act. But that is a little bit misleading because some of that legislation is pretty weak, and in other places it's strong. And so, as a proxy for where pay equity is really gaining momentum at the state level, these pay transparency protections are sort of a better guide to that. And in particular, so you can see that on both coasts, the Northeast, the West, and even in the Central and the North Coast, we're getting stronger and stronger pay transparency laws. And along with that are coming strong pay equity laws, strengthening what we have at the federal level. So in New Jersey, for example, employers are required to submit equal pay reports. There are salary range disclosures for Connecticut and Colorado, reporting on diversity on boards in California, and California has now brought back that component to reporting from that was done for the EEOC for 2017 and 2018. that was shelved by the Trump administration, but now it's come back under California SB 973 for California employers. So pay data is mandated by California for California employers. Similarly, that has gone into effect for Illinois too. So it's now the second state to implement pay data reporting, and it also adds public disclosure, which the California legislation does not. All right, so that's going from the federal to the state. Now let's zoom out for a moment, and I'll just spend a couple minutes on this and just say pay equity, diversity, equity, inclusion more generally, and pay equity specifically is becoming is being advanced by legislatures and governments around the world. This slide focuses on predominantly on Europe, but it includes Canada as well. Canada's been at the forefront of pay equity legislation recently too, and so has Australia, in particular the state of Victoria has been pushing ahead with pay equity legislation. So it's an international effort. There's international pressure to address pay equity. Multinationals really need to pay attention to it. There, we have it at the federal level with the new incoming administration and the changes at the OFCCP and the EEOC. And then again, with this increasingly, the strengthening of legislation at the state level. Okay. So let's turn now to DEI auditing and workforce data. What's the connection between those two? So very generally, diversity, equity, and inclusion monitoring brings together diverse data sources from across the organization. And we've illustrated that in terms of these data silos. And sometimes there are more of these, and there are fewer of these. But basically, we wanted to emphasize the idea that diversity, equity, inclusion is essentially a novel way of combining data. It has novel data requirements for bringing data together from diverse areas that is normally used for other purposes. So, for instance, there's data that's particular to the individual, such as their identification, their gender, their race. Then there's the whole applicant tracking information about who has applied, how those applicants proceeded and processed, what are the success rates for applicants of different genders, race, ethnicities. Same with retention and rehire and termination dates, keeping track of that at the employee level. Performance reviews might fall into that category as well. And these may be on different systems, but we're just sort of putting them into one silo for the purpose of this discussion. Promotions, lateral changes, sometimes demotions, that's relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations, particularly for both for pay equity, making sure we're getting the compensation right for the position, and also for tracking success rates on promotions and so on. Union status, whether employee, what sector of a workforce is unionized, what the contractual obligations of that collective bargaining agreement are critical to keep track of as well. And then there's jurisdictional differences that we just saw a moment ago. There are different states with different requirements. There are federal requirements, and then there are international requirements if you work in multiple nations. So that's one of these data silos. Another one is just about the hours that people are working and when they're working and when they took leaves, and seeing if that data is being tracked properly. A third is the pay data. Okay, that's where the pay equity audit is really focused, is in terms of explaining pay differences. So that's wages, payroll periods, types of payment, whether they're hourly or salary, and making sure that we have the job titles right for that. And then another piece is all the other compensation that employers provide. So cash bonuses, signing bonuses and performance bonuses, deferred compensation, vesting periods and exercise restrictions on equity-based awards like stock options or restricted stock units. And then there are other kinds of non-cash compensation, for example, the use of vehicles and whatnot. All right, so there's all this data out there that's relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly to pay equity issues, that needs to be brought together and rationalized and to work in sync with each other. So let's talk about, just from a broad perspective, then how do we accomplish this? How do we analyze diversity, equity, inclusion successfully when we have all these different data sources to combine? So as we've just sort of talked about, obviously data expertise is going to be important because data is coming from these diverse areas and it's being put together in a way that hasn't been used for for outside of diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations. Regulatory expertise is particularly important because we have federal, state, local variations in pay equity and diversity objectives and international ones. So making sure that those regulatory differences are respected in an analysis is also important. And then making sure that the statistical analysis is properly conducted too. So we think about these as forming a triangle of trust, where you want to have trust in that the data is being interpreted and processed properly, that the regulatory expertise is there, that the data, so that we're meeting the requirements and the regulations that are appropriate in the appropriate context, regulatory context, and then finally that the analysis is sound and defensible. Okay, focusing on data, on those silos, being able to bring those together. They're basically 3 steps: that extract, transform, and load statements. What we're going to really be digging into step 2 here, because that's really where we see the issues of data quality and data validations being where we're going to spend some time today. And then once those are conducted properly, then the data would be properly interpreted and properly aligned with a statistical analysis, so that the data that is cleaned and complete is going to be properly interpreted in a statistical analysis. Okay, so we're emphasizing data here, and just a couple of sort of references for this. There are real financial implications to data problems. So just it's been estimated that inaccurate data cost the U.S. economy $3.1 trillion in 2016. 1 in 3 business leaders don't trust the information they use to make decisions, that the underlying data that they don't have trust in. On average, U.S. organizations believe that 32% of their data, almost a third of their data, is inaccurate. Over 90% of executives indicated that revenue is negatively affected by inaccurate data in terms of wasted resources, lost productivity, or wasted marketing and communication spend. And over 90% of senior executives are concerned about the negative impact of data and analytics on corporate reputation, which is particularly important in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. And only 10% of senior executives felt their organization excels in managing the data, the quality of their data and their analytics. So there's a real need for this, and the rule rather than the exception is to feel that there are problems with the underlying data, particularly with respect to these diverse silos of data that we're bringing together for diversity, equity, and inclusion analysis. Okay, so the importance of clean data, we refer to it as the elephant in the room. We'll come back to that in a moment. But we've identified really 5 fundamental features, dimensions that we call them, of data quality: completeness, validity, consistency across those different data silos or different data sources, different systems, consistency between data fields, and anomaly detection. So improving data quality is important for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's also important just more generally for organizations to be on top of data and to have confidence in their data, as we just saw. It's a broader issue, data quality, much broader than diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that's going to be our focus for the rest of this talk. All right, so let's just dig into these 5 dimensions, at least briefly here. So completeness, what we're referring to here is missing data, okay? Are there any missing values in the data? So a big question is, why are they missing? There's a term, missing at random, MAR, which is often assumed for statistical analyses, but typically it's the case for the kind of data that we're working for here in compensation and human resource data. It's not missing randomly. It's just not like the data has been randomly discarded. There are systematic reasons why data is not collected. When data is completely missing, we're sort of in a situation potentially of what Donald Rumsfeld referred to as unknown unknowns. There are factors that may be affecting compensation or affecting hiring decisions that we're just not tracking. An organization's just not tracking. They're just not conscious of them. So that's one set of issues. What might be completely off the table? The other issue are things where we're missing data, important data. We have it for some employees, but not for other employees. So it's important to make those distinctions between missing, completely missing, and partially missing, because one is really sort of thinking outside the box, what we might be missing, what kind of information is not being written down, what kind of information is not being recorded at all. And then the other one is about why is it being recorded inconsistently, or how is it that we're missing some fields. Sometimes that happens as a function of how the data is being processed. So the cost of generating and recording and acquiring missing data, when data is not completely, when data is completely missing, what that's telling us is that that data is likely costly. There's likely additional cost in generating and recording that data. And part of the analysis that we conduct, that one conducts here in terms of particularly pay equity risk, is giving you a sense as to the value potentially of generating that data that would help close unexplained pay differences between employees. So some of the common missing fields are performance reviews, other performance measures, position attributes, responsibilities, and skills. Sometimes the employment history is spotty, where we are missing, or it's incomplete about potential leaves of absences. So for example, for some HR and payroll systems, they may only support one hire and termination date per employee. For employees that are rehired, this lack of data could lead to inaccurate measures of employee tenure and could make an employee appear to be overpaid. Anytime there's a lack of complete data, it can have serious implications on the pay equity audit results or diversity, equity, inclusion more generally. All right, and then prior positions, prior experience in education, oftentimes that's locked away in costly doc formats that would be helpful in explaining compensation and position differences. Okay, number two, we get to the issue of data validity. Do the data conform with schematic requirements? So what does that mean? That means that if the data is meant to be words, it's words. If it's meant to be numerical, it's numerical. If it's meant to be in dollars, it's in dollars. If it's meant to be in dates, it's in dates, and so on. So validity is pretty essential, right? Once we get just past completeness, the second building block of data quality is that the data just be interpretable and it makes sense. We can have situations where location or position, something like that, are just not right. They're just not recorded properly. There's been some sort of distortion there. So validity is the second component of data quality. Then we get to, sorry, going the wrong way. There we go. Consistency of information across data, across silos. So this is the bigger consistency issue. When we join the data, when one joins data in a way that has not been joined before, okay, is that working properly? Are the join or the merge keys are causing problems? Are they inconsistent in some way? Perhaps the same employee ID, but different names or different positions in different systems, particularly different positions. Some are static and some are static records that are just recording their current position, and other systems will be recording historical positions, and so there'll be mismatches based on that. So these discrepancies have to be resolved in order to arrive at a single source of truth. All right, so then the next component of consistency is between data fields. All right, potentially, this is a question: does the data make sense? And there's some examples here where the hours could be infeasible, or the termination date precedes the hire date. Again, that could be this incompleteness of the temporal record. The position start date could precede the hire date. That could happen because, and has happened because of an acquisition, where someone's recorded as being in a position due to their former, due to the point at which they were hired in the company that was acquired, but now their position, now their hire date with the current acquiring company is later than their position start date. So knowing what these incongruities mean and how to interpret them, taking them back to the organization, say, okay, what's the interpretation of that is critically important. Otherwise, you're going to get results that don't make sense. So another example is when the compensation type is listed as salaried, but the rate of pay is listed as hourly because perhaps there was some sort of internal conversion done for some subset of the data, and that needs to be straightened out. Okay, and then finally, where those other ones are really categorizing errors, this fifth component of data quality, anomaly detection, may not be detecting errors. So these are in extreme or infrequent values. Some of the examples here are the people with the highest compensation. And one aspect of this that's common across these different examples is that it's for a tiny subset of the employee records, okay? So for a very small number of employees, we'll see very high compensation, very high bonus rates, maybe excessive overtime, or the people that have been with the company the longest. So all these data, the reason that they're important to flag and to take back to the organization is because they can be very influential. They could be wrong too, right? They might be we've already had the validity filter, which is to say, okay, is it even possible, right? So if someone has a tenure of 100 years or something like that, then that would be flagged at the validity stage. But here we're talking about values that are plausible, that could be accurate, but we just want to make sure they're verified because they're very far away from the bulk of the employee data, and that means that they can be very influential in the statistical analysis. So we just want to make sure those are double checked and properly interpreted. Okay, so those are the 5 elements, the 5 dimensions of data quality that we think are really important that we test for and that one should be aware of. And it's a way of organizing the issue of making sure your data is complete and accurate. So how does that fit into the DEI monitoring process on a monthly basis? So to be effective, DEI monitoring has to occur regularly, for example, on a monthly or quarterly basis. So we're provided this schematic to sort of reflect that. So this graphic shows how the 5 dimensions of data quality fit into that monitoring process, that DEI monthly monitoring process. So at each month or quarter, the relevant data are pulled and combined. That's what the first down arrow is representing here. And then that data is put together and transformed appropriately to be a coherent data set. Then we get to this cleanse state, and that's where these 5 dimensions of data quality really come into play. And it's at this point where if there are any problems are found, problems with consistency, validity, and completeness, and so on, and even the anomalies, if they haven't been fully vetted yet, they're sent back. Okay, they're sent back to the organization saying, okay, here are the issues with the data that we pulled. Can they be addressed? And so this way, they're going to be fixed permanently rather than trying to fix them on the fly through ad hoc back and forth. We think the best way to do this is to really take these issues back to the organization and see that they're fixed at the source rather than trying to make ad hoc adjustments. So once that's done, the data is pulled again and checked again, cleansed again, and these 5 data quality elements are checked again. And at this point, the anomalies, any anomalies, number 5 on the data quality checklist that were previously flagged and sent back, they would be have a notation on them. Okay, to say that yes, these are accurate observations. And so then we can move, and it's only at that point that we move on to the analytics. All right. So that's a way to think about the DEI data process, the DEI cleansing data and checking data in the context of a monthly monitoring process as to how that would operate. Because as the workforce changes, the data is changing, and so there's always the opportunity for errors and incompleteness to creep in. All right. So now from that, I'm going to move from data quality into describing how data cleaning fits into DEI monitoring. And the particular emphasis here, as this slide suggests, is on pay equity monitoring. We'll see in a moment how pay equity auditing and monitoring is a natural complement and in some sense a precursor to more deep or equity examinations. So we're going to start, the focus is on pay equity, but I'll try to show how the issues that we discuss here have broader application to diversity and other elements of inclusion, other non-pay issues in equity and inclusion. All right. So let me just first focus on what are pay equity audit essentials? What is a pay equity audit? So a pay equity audit explains wage rates through the lens of pay analysis groups in terms of identified business factors and systematic wage differences between protected classes. Okay, so, and those systematic wage differences between protected classes, like between genders or race ethnicities, disability status, those are potential liabilities for an organization. A pay equity audit, PEA, identifies pay disparities. Those are those systematic wage differences that are not explained by legitimate business factors. A group, such as a gender or race ethnicity, or the combination of those two, is impacted if they in fact have a systematic wage difference. Pay disparities are the portion of the pay gaps that remain after identified business factors are controlled for. And as I just mentioned, they represent potential liabilities. Part of a pay equity audit and ongoing monitoring is to provide remediation strategies. Some are data oriented, and some are in terms of getting those legitimate business factors correct, because again, collecting that data can be costly, and it's worth maybe investing in these additional measures of performance, say, if it's going to help explain compensation differences. And then the other dimension of remediation is actually making compensation adjustments. And kind of the right approach depends on the context, obviously. So similar considerations apply to the other elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion monitoring. Measuring differences in application rates for applicants in terms of gender and race ethnicity. What are the application rate differences? Offer rates from applicant to making a job offer. Are those rates different between genders and race ethnicities? Promotion rates, retention rates. So all of those elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and broader notions of equity are part of the larger umbrella of that we're talking about here. So we'll talk in a minute about how the pay equity audit fits into that broader set of concerns. Okay, so, but as an organizing principle, I just want to start with digging into a pay equity audit. We talked about what a pay equity audit is, what it provides, but I want to build that out a little bit more. So we've mentioned data integrity. A pay equity audit, or DEI monitoring, has to have that essential component of making sure the data is complete and valid. It should provide a defensible segmentation of the workforce into pay analysis groups or similar groups for different issues of diversity and equity. Measuring legitimate pay differences, that has an analog too for measuring those acceptance rates, trying to control for differences in applicants or differences in candidates for promotion. It quantifies the risk to the organization. That's something particularly relevant to pay equity because of the burden on the employer to disprove that there's discrimination there. It should also validate those findings. So a statistical analysis is more than just pushing a button. It's multidimensional. We'll get to that in just a moment. Should also be able to provide some direction in terms of root causes. And then we also touched on remediation strategies. And then again, we're talking about this in an ongoing analysis, not a one and done type of approach, but something that's constantly monitoring in a monthly or quarterly basis how your situation is changing. And then finally, we'll talk about this ninth element, which is legal privilege, and that should be part of a DEI approach. It's important to basically control communication, control information, leave the employer with options for controlling communication. All right, pay equity data. We've spent a fair amount of time talking about completeness, consistency, and validity, and influence in terms of anomaly detection. What I just want to emphasize here is that obviously data has to be of high quality, both in terms of the factors that are meant to explain compensation and also in terms of the compensation data itself. Another element here is that data is both of a structured format and unstructured in terms of resumes that may not be digitized or broken down into in terms of an applicant hiring software. So prior experience is another example of information that is maybe hard and costly, more costly to really bring into analyses, but it's important to bring it in especially if it's relevant to setting compensation. Okay, and then the last piece here that I have under data is really about how the data is supposed to be interpreted. Making sure that differences in compensation philosophies. An example of a difference in compensation philosophy is when part of the workforce is unionized. So there's collective bargaining agreements that are going to be governing how elements of compensation are structured that are going to be absent for other workers in the organization. All right. So that also ties into constructing groups, constructing pay analysis groups for pay equity audits or other types of groups for making sure that we're making appropriate comparisons between employees. The key point of this slide is a pretty brief one, is that we're doing fundamentally in all of these elements of diversity and equity and inclusion analysis, looking for differences between protected classes. those are fundamentally statistical analyses. And when we segment the workforce to look at them separately and to examine statistical significance separately for different groups like executives versus professionals versus service workers, we want to make sure that we can statistically defend those differences that we're making, those distinctions, those separate groupings that we're making. So it's important that this kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion monitoring also be segmenting the data in a statistically defensible way. All right, measuring the legitimate pay differences. Once the pay analysis groups are determined or the groupings are determined, the pay equity audit usually conducts regression analyses. That's a standard tool, and there are similar tools using types of regression analyses for other diversity measures and equity measures, such as the acceptance rates, offer rates, promotion rates, those types of things. So these are reflecting differences in skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And a key piece here, and this is why there's a synergy between pay equity and other elements of equity, in that when legitimate business factors play an important role in explaining wage differences, that raises the question as to why they do. Okay, so for instance, if the average job level is significantly different between whites and Hispanics in a particular segment of an organization, this job level difference can explain and likely will explain some of the Hispanic-white wage gap. Okay, these differences may be outside of an employer's responsibility if they reflect differences in training or aptitudes in candidates for various positions. But alternatively, the very fact that job level absorbs some of the difference in pay between whites and Hispanics may be indicative of a problem with promotion opportunities or promotion procedures. So it's in this sense that pay equity provides the foundation for a deeper level of equity investigation. Okay, right. So the next, once those legitimate business factors are controlled for, we look at what's left over, and that brings us to measuring gender, race, ethnicity, or again disability, or sexual orientation. These are protected groups under different jurisdictions that we would look for systematic, one would want to look for systematic pay or, again, promotion rate differences. And a key point here is that an employer or organization ought to be able to view and quantify these measures at different, and think about them from different levels. From a workforce level, what are the overall risks? Within individual departments, what are the risks? So what are the risks in terms of what's the cost of the disparities in terms of hourly differences? What's the cost of differences in terms of annual differences in compensation? So these are all and how does it vary by department? How does it vary by location? Measuring risks is multidimensional. It's not just a one number. One should look for approaches to DEI monitoring that give you multiple dimensions of feedback in this sense. Okay, this is getting at validation of findings. So there's a temptation to think about, okay, what's a statistical analysis of pay equity? What's running a regression? Then you look at the regression results. Well, there's a lot more that goes into it than that, or should go into it. And I've listed some of the validation points here. So cohort comparisons, you can think of as very simple comparisons between employees. They leave out a lot of legitimate business factors, but they try to make a more focused comparison. And one would want to see and have a yardstick as to the extent to which overall pay differences that are not explained, say between men and women, are supported by cohort comparisons between smaller groups of matched men and women who are in the same position or who have some other common feature. To what extent do we continue to get the same signal back that there are pay differences between men and women? Robustness to business factors, that is on this continuum from a very small analysis based on cohorts up to a full analysis, which is the central pay equity model. There, one want to look at what happens if you vary the set of business factors. To what extent are male-female wage differences robust to the legitimate business factors that are considered? The atypical data that we flagged in the data quality process in step 5, atypical data, you want to see what effect that has on pay equity results. We want to understand the managerial and leadership context of potential discriminatory wage differences, right? It can happen that you'll have a same gender discrimination where, say, predominantly women have a lower, are paid less, and their managers are predominantly women, right? That can happen, but you want to be aware of that context. Okay, how is that? You know, is the disparity that we're measuring between men and women consistent with sort of the managerial makeup and the leadership makeup as well? Are there alternative interpretations? This gets back to potentially missing drivers of legitimate business factors could be driving compensation. And then as well, you want to see that the predictions that you're getting from your pay equity audit are aligned with external market comparisons, okay? That they're not explicitly taking them into account, but at least they're not wide of a mark, too wide of the mark in terms of what the external market is telling you where compensation should be. Okay. Another element of a pay equity audit has to do with identifying root causes. And this also has an analog for hiring, promotion, and retention in terms of looking at those who are either appear to be the most underpaid, okay, in a pay equity context, or those for whom they did not receive the promotion, or they were not hired, but they looked really like they should have been hired. Okay, so is there anything systematic that we can see about those special cases, right? That helps to point us in the direction of root causes. All right, so then in terms of solutions, we just have a few minutes to touch on this, but pay equity solutions, again, fall into a couple of different categories. And some of them are thinking about a greater investment in legitimate business factors and documenting, right? And making and perhaps standardizing compensation to a more structured into a more structured approach, a more documented approach. Then there's potentially making compensation adjustments, and that's where you want a solution that gives you the ability to focus in on a department, to focus in and to implement a particular remediation strategy in terms of who you're going to remediate and what metrics you're going to use to make adjustments and to see what impact that has. Okay, so you want to be able to run simulations and ask questions about what happens when I make these kinds of compensation adjustments to the pay disparities that we've identified. Okay, so that brings us back to where we started, really, which is the importance of monitoring, right? For all these dimensions, for monitoring diversity, for monitoring pay equity and application rates and promotion rates, you have to keep up with that on an ongoing basis. It can't be just a one-off type of analysis. It has to be done and reevaluated regularly to see what direction issues are trending in. Okay, this brings us to the last point, which is it's important for an employer who's engaged with diversity, equity, and inclusion monitoring to be able to maintain control of communications. And that what that means is that throughout the DEI monitoring, organizations should be able to control the process and how communication of the results is communicated. The purpose of working within privilege protocols is that they're set up by legal counsel. They're meant to put the whole analysis within the context of attorney-client privilege. And so we see that's the predominant approach to proactive DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion monitoring, is to consider the process as a component of legal advice. So in that sense, it should be protected to some extent by legal privilege. Okay, so a lot of that was focused on pay equity, but I was trying to also explain how it fits into other diversity and equity measures. Just a couple of comments here about why employers should obviously be focused beyond just pay equity. The first is that DEI is a central component of ESG standards, notably the social responsibility and the corporate governance elements, and ESG is a high priority for investors, governments, and consumers and employees. Increasing awareness of gender and racial discrimination brings greater urgency and attention for organizations to meet these social responsibilities. So again, pay equity and diversity measures are central to meeting those responsibilities. And then inclusion and workforce dynamics, like these rates of retention and promotion, are equally important to employer success in reaching social responsibility objectives. So, sorry, just past that. So in terms of workforce dynamics, obviously we've been talking about them in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. We want to identify deficiencies in the applicant pool, deficiencies in offer rates and in promotion and in retention. And then I haven't said too much about inclusion, but inclusion surveys are critical because they give you that feedback from employees as to how they perceive issues of equity and diversity. All right, and then finally, so getting DEI right means acknowledging the role of data and it's worth the effort. So just to bring this back to where we were focused on, leaders attribute a range of business benefits to diversity, equity, inclusion, including, and this is based on academic research, that there's higher levels of employee engagement, greater team diversity, and greater success in recruiting and retaining top talent. So that follows from a real pursuit of diversity, equity, inclusion goals. So on the flip side, in the context of increasing pay transparency that we see right across multiple jurisdictions. In fact, we just had to update that chart on pay transparency that I showed at the outset by state, because more and more states are passing pay transparency legislation. That means that employees are better able to communicate and find out what others are making, and they need to know why. DE&I reduces regulatory risk by addressing and preventing gender, race, ethnicity-based discrimination, and enhances employees' perceptions of fairness, okay, which is particularly important in this context of increasing conversations about pay transparencies, and improves performance, and it manages increasingly diverse stakeholders by boosting the perception of your brand in terms of its diversity, meeting diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. Okay, so thank you. And I just want to close with a quote here from the author of the Equal Rights Amendment, Alice Stokes Paul, who observed that there's nothing complicated about equality. The common reason underlying the triangle of trust that we introduced a ways back on data, regulatory expertise, and analytics should be to make the pay equity and the diversity and equity inclusion analysis simple for the employer. A DEI partner provides guidance that simplifies the navigation through diverse regulatory environments, the complications of data that we've spent a fair amount of time on, and through the statistical analysis and the validation of findings that is multidimensional. It's not just a simple correlation. It's not just a simple regression. So those are the important steps that one should be looking for in thinking about how to tackle DEI monitoring on an ongoing basis and making improvements to it. So thank you for your time today. Bye-bye.